In the summer of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys slipped into the harbor of Messina under a blood-red Sicilian sun, their sails tattered and their decks unnaturally quiet. Dockworkers shouted greetings that died in the salt air as the first bodies were lowered over the rails, swollen and black with the marks of an unseen enemy. No trumpets sounded, no armies marched. The collapse did not announce itself with banners or battle cries. It arrived in the fur of rats and the breath of fleas, a silent passenger that would unravel the entire medieval world from within. By the time the citizens of Messina realized something was wrong, the invisible machinery of their society had already begun to seize. The plague did not merely kill people, it killed the assumptions that held Europe together, and the rupture it caused would echo for centuries, reshaping everything that came after in ways no one alive could yet imagine. 14th century Europe stood at the peak of its medieval confidence, a continent stitched together by the iron threads of feudal obligation, the church's moral authority, and the slow rhythm of agrarian life. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London had grown fat on trade routes that stretched from the Baltic to the Levant. Cathedrals rose like stone prayers toward heaven, and the manorial system promised that every peasant, every lord, every priest knew his place in the divine order. The population had doubled in the previous 2 centuries, pushing fields to their limits and filling markets with the chatter of merchants and the clang of blacksmith hammers. Kings ruled by the grace of God, popes interpreted his will, and the great wheel of seasons turned without question. Yet beneath this surface of order lay a society already stretched thin, its people living closer together than ever before, breathing the same air, sharing the same wells, and unknowingly preparing the perfect corridor for a disease that would expose every crack in the foundation. The stage was set not for conquest but for something far more intimate and devastating. Daily life before the rupture moved to the patient cadence of the soil and the bell tower. In the English countryside, serfs rose at dawn to the lowing of cattle and the distant tolling of matins, their hands calloused from the same strips of land their fathers had worked for generations. In Italian city-states, merchants opened their ledgers by candlelight, while housewives haggled over bread still warm from communal ovens. Children played in narrow alleys where the smell of wood smoke mixed with the tang of tanning hides. Noblewomen rode out with falcons on their wrists, their laughter carrying across meadows that had never known hunger. The church's processions wound through streets fragrant with incense and roasting chestnuts, promising protection from famine, flood, and war. Life felt eternal in its repetition. Birth, labor, tithe, death, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow would mirror today. No one suspected that the very closeness that made community possible would soon become the vector of its undoing. The first warnings drifted westward like ghosts on the trade winds, dismissed as exotic tales from distant lands. Travelers returning from the Black Sea spoke in hushed voices of entire Crimean cities emptied overnight, of Mongol armies catapulting corpses over walls in a grotesque siege tactic, and of a sickness that turned men into living shadows within days. Venetian and Genoese merchants shrugged. Plagues had come and gone before, always contained by prayer and quarantine. In the monasteries, scribes copied warnings from Arab physicians who had seen something similar centuries earlier, yet the Latin texts were filed away beside treatises on the humors. No edicts were issued, no harbors closed for long. The invisible signs accumulated quietly, dead rats in the streets of Constantinople, strange swellings in the groins of sailors, a silence that replaced the usual clamor of eastern ports. By the time these fragments reached European ears, the disease had already boarded the ships, traveling faster than any messenger could warn. Tension rose not with fanfare, but with the slow creep of rumor and the first unexplained deaths. In Messina, the harbor began to smell of something sweeter and more terrible than fish. Sailors staggered ashore with dark blotches blooming beneath their skin. Physicians in their long robes applied leeches and muttered about corrupted air, while priests rang bells and ordered processions that only gathered more bodies in the squares. Lords ordered their manors sealed, yet the servants who brought food from the villages carried the invisible passenger on their clothes. Markets emptied earlier each day. Mothers kept children indoors without knowing why. The great wheel of feudal duty began to wobble as laborers failed to appear for the harvest, and the first whispers of panic moved through taverns like smoke. Still, the authorities clung to the old explanations. Divine punishment for sin, bad alignment of planets, poisoned wells. No one yet understood that the system itself was being eaten from the inside. Rulers and church leaders made decisions that would accelerate the fracture. In Paris, the king ordered streets swept and fires lit to purify the air, measures that did nothing against the fleas. In Florence, the Signoria imposed quarantines too late and too unevenly, allowing wealthy families to flee to their country estates, while the poor remained trapped in the contagion. Popes in Avignon issued bulls promising absolution for the dying, yet their own cardinals fell one by one. The very institutions meant to protect society instead revealed their fragility. When priests refused last rites for fear of infection, faith itself began to corrode. Sumptuary laws were passed to prevent the lower classes from dressing above their station, a desperate attempt to preserve hierarchy even as death erased all distinctions. Each decree, each flight of the powerful, each denial of the obvious only tightened the noose around the social order that had seemed unbreakable for centuries. The moment the system began to fail arrived without a single dramatic battle, but in 1,000 small surrenders repeated across the continent. In London, the streets filled with carts piled high with bodies that no one bothered to bury properly. In Venice, the canals reflected funeral pyres that burned night and day. The labor force simply vanished. Fields stood unharvested while grain rotted in the stalks. Mills fell silent because the millers were gone. Guilds collapsed as masters and apprentices died together, leaving workshops empty and contracts unenforceable. The feudal contract, that ancient promise of protection in exchange for service, dissolved when lords could no longer feed or defend their serfs and serfs could no longer be forced to stay. The collapse was not loud. It was the quiet sound of empty church bells, abandoned plows, and the sudden absence of the everyday voices that had once filled every marketplace and manor. Human consequences unfolded in waves of terror and transformation that no chronicle could fully capture. Families watched loved ones swell and blacken in hours, the air thick with the stench of gangrene and the cries of the dying. Entire villages emptied overnight, their survivors stumbling towards cities that had already sealed their gates. Flagellant processions whipped themselves bloody through the streets, their chants rising above the moans of the afflicted as if pain alone could appease an angry god. Women gave birth alone in darkened rooms. Children wandered among corpses searching for parents who would never answer. The social bonds that had defined identity, kinship, guild, parish snapped one by one. Fear turned neighbors into accusers. Jews were massacred in Strasbourg and Basel on the false charge of well poisoning, revealing how quickly civilization could descend into barbarism when the old certainties vanished. The living envied the dead their peace. Social breakdown deepened as the invisible hierarchies that once ordered life were exposed and overturned. With half the population gone, surviving peasants suddenly found themselves able to demand wages that would have been unthinkable before. Lords who had once dictated terms now begged for hands to bring in the harvest. Serfs walked away from their strips of land and offered their labor to the highest bidder, shattering the manorial system that had endured for half a millennium. In the cities, guilds relaxed entry rules because there were simply not enough trained craftsmen left. Women entered trades previously closed to them, taking up the hammers and looms of dead husbands. The church, having lost perhaps 40% of its clergy, struggled to replace them. Its moral monopoly weakened as survivors questioned why God had spared the wicked and taken the pious. Old laws against vagrancy became impossible to enforce when so many were now masterless. The entire pyramid of medieval society tilted, its base no longer willing to support a summit that could not protect it. The long-term historical impact rippled outward like cracks spreading across a frozen lake. The labor shortage that began in 1348 permanently altered the economic balance of Europe, forcing the rise of a money economy and the decline of serfdom in the West. Peasant revolts erupted in France in 1358 and in England in 1381, their leaders citing the plague's lessons that all men were equal before death, and therefore should be equal before the law. Art shifted from serene Madonnas to grotesque dance macabre frescoes that reminded viewers of mortality's democracy. Universities, filled with new students from lower classes, who could now afford the fees their dead relatives had paid in labor. The Renaissance did not spring fully formed from classical texts alone. It was fertilized by the vacuum left when the old world died. Trade routes reopened, but the confidence that had once underpinned them was gone forever, replaced by a wary, questioning spirit that would eventually challenge kings and popes alike. Yet the most haunting legacy was the knowledge that a single microscopic organism could achieve what no army or revolution had managed: the quiet dismantling of an entire civilization's self-understanding. The plague did not end with the last death in 1351. It lingered in the higher wages, the freer peasants, the shaken faith, and the new individualism that replaced collective obedience. Survivors passed down stories of streets paved with bodies and skies empty of birds, warning their children that the world could end not with fire or flood, but with silence and swelling flesh. Europe emerged leaner, more mobile, and paradoxically more alive, yet forever marked by the realization that the structures humans build are only as strong as the bodies that sustain them. The collapse had been hidden only until it was complete, and once revealed, it could never be forgotten. In the end, the true rupture was not the millions who perished, but the invisible order that died with them. What remained was a continent forced to reinvent itself on the graves of its certainties, a world that had learned, at terrible cost, that disease could accomplish what swords could not. The bells that once rang for matins now tolled for the dead, and in their echo one could hear the faint, persistent question that still lingers across the centuries. How fragile is the society we believe will last forever, and how quietly can it come undone when the enemy travels not on horseback but on the wind? The hidden collapse had done its work, leaving behind a new age that would never again trust the silence before the next unseen storm.